The year was 1869, and the relentless sun still clung to the canyons of the high desert. Dust settled in fine red sheets over abandoned railroad camps and trails carved out by men who had since moved on, and the air smelled of sagebrush and desperation. The great iron dream of the railroad was complete, not with a final cheer, but with a slow, grinding dispersal. Tents were struck, makeshift towns vanished, and the imported labor was left to the mercy of a land that had never welcomed them. Amid this desolation, a quiet exodus was happening, one the history books rarely paused to notice. Young women, their dark hair bound in practical knots and their clothes faded to the color of dust, walking away from a life they had once believed was a promise. Mai had not imagined herself a pioneer. She was 22 with hands calloused from long days over laundry tubs and cooking fires. When she and her family had followed the promise of work from Guangdong to the raw American West, the foreman had spoken of steady wages and a new life. She would be a cook's assistant, a laundress for the crews, work that was hard but honest. For a while, the world felt contained and orderly, a traveling camp filled with the clatter of tools and the scent of ginger and hot oil, laughing with other girls about the rugged men they served. But as the last spike was driven and the company moved on, their world shrank. The pay stopped, the foreman vanished, and the promises turned to dust. By the summer of 1869, Mai and a small group of women were stranded, left behind near a dried-up creek bed in the foothills of the Sierras. Rumors traveled on the wind, carried by the few drifters who passed. The company wasn't coming back, jobs in the nearest towns were for white men only, and the lands east were even harsher. Mai wrote a letter to a cousin in San Francisco, a letter she had no way to send, and packed a small bundle, a scarf, a small jade pendant from her mother, a handful of dried rice. She told herself it would only be a few days before they found a way forward. Secretly, she feared they never would. She was not alone. All along the Finnish railway, hundreds of Chinese laborers and their families found themselves adrift. Some were men who sought work in mines or on farms. Others were women, wives, and daughters, who were now utterly abandoned, with no money, no protection, and no place in this new world. Records of their fates are scarce, lost to the vast, indifferent landscape. Few imagined they might one day become the property of strangers. The day the rancher came, Mai and the other women were huddled in the shade of a rock outcropping, their water skins long empty. The sun beat down, and the silence of the desert was broken only by the buzz of insects. Then, they heard it, the slow, steady plod of a horse. A lone rider appeared on the ridge, a silhouette against the blinding sky. Mai stood with her hands clasped, shaking so badly from thirst she nearly dropped her small bundle. The other women did the same, some staring with wide, fearful eyes, some too weak to react. The rider was a tall man in a dusty hat, his face weathered by sun and solitude. He shouted something in a language most of them barely understood. A few of the older women, who had picked up words in the camps, tried to speak. He dismounted, his movements unhurried, and made them sit in the dirt. Mai expected to be left to die. She had been told that the white men in this country were ghosts, unpredictable and often cruel. Instead, the man walked through their small group, his gaze taking in their cracked lips and hollow cheeks. He gestured for one woman to open her bundle, saw nothing of value, and moved on. He herded them into a group, gesturing back the way he had come. There was no brutality, but no kindness either, just a grim efficiency, as though he were rounding up stray cattle. Mai walked for what felt like miles, her legs trembling, until they reached a homestead carved out of the unforgiving land. Lian, a sharp-eyed girl who had worked as a seamstress, stumbled beside Mai. She had come to America dreaming of opening her own shop. Now, she stared at the rancher walking ahead of them, his rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. She whispered to Mai in a voice hoarse from thirst, "He doesn't look like a monster." Mai nodded but said nothing. Their destination was not a proper shelter, just a fenced corral near a dusty barn. Barbed wire, a new and vicious invention, gleamed under a hard blue sky, and the ground was baked earth. A single water trough stood in the corner, but there were no beds, no shade, no food in sight. The rancher, a solitary figure in this vast landscape, pointed them toward the corral. He filled the trough from a well pump, the squeal of the handle a sound more beautiful than music. He said nothing more before turning and walking toward the main house. The first day passed in a haze of heat and exhaustion. I huddled with Leanne and a few others, sharing the precious water and whispering fears. One girl wept until she had no tears left. Another muttered prayers to ancestors who felt very far away. Night fell quickly, bringing a desert cold that bit through their thin clothes. Somewhere, a coyote howled. The rancher ignored them. I tried to sleep on the hard ground, shivering violently. She thought of home, of the smell of rain on fertile soil, and of how she had imagined this new country would mean a future. Instead, it meant waiting in a dusty pen, stomach empty, life in the hands of a stranger. Over the next days, the man brought them food sporadically. A sack of cornmeal one day, a pot of thin stew the next, sometimes nothing at all. The women learned to watch for him, to wait quietly by the fence when he appeared. Some tried to speak, offering to work. He just shook his head, his face unreadable. One evening, the rancher, whose name they learned was Isaac, stopped by the fence where I sat. He hesitated, then knelt to pass a wooden bowl of something steaming through the rails. "Stew," he said, the word rough but clear enough. I stared, startled. She wanted to thank him but lacked the English. Instead, she nodded, clutching the bowl as though it were gold. The warmth filled her hands, then her belly. When she looked up, he was already walking away. That moment, small, almost ordinary, unsettled her more than their capture had. The enemy, the stranger, was supposed to be monstrous. Yet here was a man, looking as weary as the land itself, offering a bowl of stew where none was required. It made the world feel strange, unmoored. Leanne, watching, whispered, "Be careful. Kindness can cost you." I didn't know what she meant. Not yet. Not all encounters were gentle. A hired hand, a lanky drifter named Flint with a grin too wide, would sometimes ride by, making a show of tossing scraps of jerky toward the women, laughing as they scrambled for them. His gaze lingered longer than it should have. When one girl turned away in disgust, he spat in the dust near her feet. Power hung in the dry air like a smell, invisible but undeniable. I began to understand what Leanne meant. By the end of that first week, the women were changed. Their hopes were gone, replaced by a quiet, desperate focus. Hair matted with dust, faces gaunt, they spoke less, moved slower, and learned to read the moods of their captor with silent precision. Survival meant watching, waiting, adapting. Some tried to stay invisible. Others, especially the bolder ones, sought favor, a nod here, an attempt at a smile there. No one said it aloud, but the unspoken truth grew heavier each day. In this place, rules were thin and hunger was strong. One night, a sudden storm swept the valley, turning the dust to a slick of red mud. I lay awake under a soaked blanket, teeth chattering, when the light from a lantern cut across the corral. The rancher, Isaac, stopped near their huddled group. He spoke in English, too quick to follow, then pointed his lantern, scanning faces as though choosing livestock. His eyes landed on my. She froze as he beckoned. Leanne squeezed her hand briefly before letting go. I stood on shaking legs and followed, mud sucking at her boots. Isaac looked her over, said something she couldn't understand, then waved her toward the farmhouse. She hesitated. His hand tightened on her arm, firm but not brutal. He led her out of the rain, past the barn, and into the dark house. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A small stove hissed. Rifles leaned against the wall and a worn Bible sat on a simple wooden table. Isaac turned to her and with careful slowness said in broken pidgin, "You work." "Cook." "Cleaned him." I nodded, startled to understand. He gestured to a chair and a pile of mending. He pointed to himself and said, "Isaac," then softer, almost an afterthought, "Safe here." The word landed like a stone in water, rippling outward. I sat, hands trembling as she touched the rough fabric. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but the room was warm, and the stove smelled faintly of food. Isaac poured something dark into a mug and set it beside her. She didn't drink. Not yet. She looked at him, at the worn holster on his hip, at his quiet authority. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away, already occupied with cleaning a saddle strap. For the first time since being abandoned, she felt something like breath return to her lungs. But safety was never simple in this land. Behind the warmth lurked uncertainty, the kind born when power tilts and one life depends quietly on another's will. Mai knew this even as she sat by the stove, fingers hesitating over the needle and thread. Isaac hadn't said much, but his meaning had been clear enough. Here she would work. Here she would eat. Here she belonged to the victor. Now, outside, the corral shivered in the cold, unaware that one of its prisoners had just stepped into a new kind of captivity, one shaped not by barbed wire, but by survival itself. Summer crept into the high desert with a quiet persistence, drying the mud to cracked earth and filling the air with the scent of hot dust and juniper. The distant sounds of progress, train whistles and blasting from mines, had faded into silence. For Mai, peace felt like a word whispered through glass, present but unreachable. She was alive, yes, fed, clothed, and kept from the brutal chaos beyond the ranch's borders. But safety here was not freedom. It was an arrangement, fragile and unnamed. Isaac changed with the season. In the spring, he had been tense, watchful, a man still fighting the land. By summer, a slower weariness replaced that edge. He smiled sometimes, though the smiles were small and tired. Occasionally he spoke without meaning to, little fragments of a life she couldn't picture, a farm back east, a brother lost in the war, the smell of rain on green fields. Mai listened, answering carefully when she could, her English improving in hesitant steps. He never asked about her life in China. She never volunteered. Silence was safer than the truth. Yet, silence could not hide the strange intimacy of their proximity. She cooked his meals, mended his clothes, and swept the floors of the quiet house. He left food where she could find it, an apple, a slice of bread still warm from the oven. At first, she took them with a gratitude that burned her cheeks. Later, she took them with a weary acceptance. The balance between them was clear. He commanded, she endured. But inside that imbalance flickered something more complex, a current neither of them seemed to know how to name. Mai felt it most in the small hours when the farmhouse was quiet except for the hum of insects and the soft crackle of the stove. She would glance up and find him watching her, not with cruelty, but with a searching loneliness. Sometimes his eyes held the same hunger she felt, not for food, but for contact, for a reminder that they were still human. That hunger frightened her more than hatred ever could. Hatred was simple. This was not. One evening, he asked her to sit, not work. The sun had dropped behind the jagged peaks, painting the room in bronze light. He poured coffee and slid the cup across the table. "You safe here?" he asked haltingly. Mai hesitated, unsure if it was a question or a warning. "Safer than outside," she said finally. He nodded, looking away, fingers drumming on the rough wood. Then, softly, almost to himself, "This land makes strange companies." She thought of Lian, still in the corral. She thought of the starving faces beyond the fence, of women who once had families and futures, now dependent on the whims of a stranger. Strange company indeed, the thought was bitter and tender all at once. The hired hand, Flint, grew bolder. His German was clumsy, but eager. He joked when she passed, offered cigarettes with a grin too wide to be harmless. Isaac said nothing at first, only watched. But one evening, when Flint lingered too long by the kitchen door while Mai was washing dishes, Isaac's voice cut through the air, sharp as broken glass. "That's enough." Flint raised his hands, laughing it off, but the look Isaac gave him was not a joke. After that, Mai understood something unspoken. She was under Isaac's protection, and protection was its own kind of claim. It kept Flint at a wary distance, but it also wrapped invisible chains around her. The kindness was real, the cage was real. Both existed at once. Sometimes she wondered what Isaac wanted from her. He never touched her, never forced words or acts. Yet his gaze lingered, and his small gifts, the extra food, the warmth of the house, safety itself, felt weighted with an expectation too subtle to name. Perhaps it was not desire in the usual sense, but something lonelier, possession born of chaos, a man grasping for meaning in his desolate world. Still, possession it was. My adapted because there was no other choice. She learned to move in the narrow space between gratitude and survival, to accept what she needed without inviting more. Each day she balanced on that tightrope, knowing a single misstep, defiance, misunderstanding, refusal, could end her fragile sanctuary. Outside the farmhouse, the West reeled under its own violent growth. Stories circulated of bandits, of mining camps where life was cheap, of women disappearing without a trace. The law was a distant rumor. I listened to these stories like someone feeling the edge of a knife, grateful for Isaac's silent barrier even as it frightened her. The moment that crystallized everything came late one sweltering afternoon. I was fetching water from the well as Isaac spoke with two rough-looking men, prospectors passing through. One of them noticed her, smirked, and said something in English that made the other laugh. Isaac's shoulders stiffened. He replied curtly. The yard went quiet, heat and tension colliding in the still air. The prospector grinned wider, taking a step toward her. In an instant, Isaac moved between them, his voice low but lethal. "Not yours." The silence that followed was absolute. The man's smile faltered. After a beat, he shrugged and turned away, muttering. The conversation stumbled back to talk of gold veins and water rights, but something fundamental had shifted. I stood by the well, hands trembling. She felt the invisible claim tighten, protection and ownership braided into one. That night, Isaac did not speak. He poured himself a measure of whiskey and stared at the wall until long after dark. I sat by the stove, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. She did neither. When she finally lay down on the small cot in the corner, sleep refused to come. She stared at the ceiling beams and thought of all the invisible bargains the wilderness demanded. Leanne's gaunt face. Flint's hungry grin. Isaac's quiet but absolute "not yours," each choice bent around survival, dignity traded for safety, power cloaked in kindness. There were no clean lines left. Outside, crickets sang in the dark fields, a thin, fragile music against the silence of a world still being born. Inside, I understood with sudden clarity that she was safe only as long as Isaac chose to guard that fragile line, and that his choice was its own form of captivity. The next morning, he greeted her with quiet politeness, as if nothing had changed. But when she began her chores and felt his watchful presence in the room, she knew the great railroad war might be over, but the battle for who owned her fate had only just begun.